Hello and welcome to the Neurology Nuts and Bolts podcast all about constructing your career in neurology. I'm your host, Sana Aslam at the Bayer Neurological Institute in Phoenix. Today, as part of the About Face series, we're going to be talking with Dr. Rita Gandhi about working in industry. Rita is a Senior Medical Director of Huntington's Disease Clinical Development at Genentech currently. After practicing as a movement disorders neurologist for about 10 years, she's been working in industry for about 5 years. Thank you for joining us and taking the time to speak with us today.
Sure, thank you. Thank you for having me, Sana.
Can you tell us a little bit about your decision to leave clinical medicine?
Sure, I'd love to. So after I left fellowship, I was very excited to do clinical medicine and truly really enjoyed it. I was in West Virginia, and so I was the director of their movement disorder program there, where I did quite a bit of deep brain stimulation and kind of set up their movement program. My entire family lived on the West Coast. So following, I think about a 5-year period or more, I decided to move to the West Coast. And I started at the Parkinson's Institute and Clinical Center, where I continued to see only movement. I was very lucky I could do only movement. But during that period of time, the Parkinson's Institute, they decided to sort of close shop. And so they shutting down their clinic, and so I was basically forced to kind of look outside to see what else was available. And in the area that I was in California, a majority of the jobs were academic, and so they didn't pay as much in it. There was a very high quality of living or a high cost of living here. Or I could do sort of a private sector job, but it was quite demanding. So it required me to do not only just movement, but also like general neurology, and there was quite a bit of call. And so during this time, I was trying to figure out if there were other options for me, and so was able to talk to the MSLs or the drug reps, and they sort of said, yeah, well, there's industry, and that's an option. And I think it was like I said, it was about 5 years ago, so I think it wasn't as widespread maybe as it is now. I feel like there's much more cachet and people are talking about it more. But it was during that time that I decided, okay, I would go ahead and start looking at other options. And it was for two main reasons. One is that the job that I currently had was folding, and so I had to find something else. And for me, I'm a single mom, so I needed to have something that was more flexible. And also I needed something that maybe had, better benefits and better pay. So that's kind of what I was looking at, is just being able to do medicine in a different way with a few more flexibilities.
Oh, that's interesting. So it was almost, you were forced to look at different career options that perhaps most of us are not familiar with.
Yeah, definitely. So it wasn't something that I necessarily would have sort of sought out on my own, but it was just my circumstance was like, okay, well, this is not going to work anymore. So you need to kind of be more flexible. And I think, California, the Bay Area, is also one of these interesting places where it is very entrepreneurial. People are often doing multiple things. And so it's not just, most of the physicians here aren't just doing clinical medicine. They're also consulting with biotech firms and, sort of doing startups. And so it's a different kind of environment. And so that also, I think, sort of meeting colleagues and hearing about what they were doing made me think, I could be thinking about other things.
To our listeners, I'd like to direct you to our episode on leaving academia from March for more in-depth discussion about leaving academic medicine. Rita, a very basic question for you. I have heard pharma and industry, those terms used interchangeably, but are they the same thing?
No, that's a great question. They often are used interchangeably, but they are different. And so when we think about industry, it's a very blanket term. The way I like to think about it is kind of like when you say, I have knee pain, right? Well, what exactly is wrong with your knee, right? Is it like an ACL tear or what specifically? So industry is a very blanket term, and under industry, you can have pharma jobs or you can have biotech jobs. And so pharma or pharmaceutical is generally, developing medications that aren't necessarily natural in origin, they can be small molecule or large molecule, whereas biotech tends to be more trying to create therapies or other types of medical apparatus that are more organic in nature. And so, like, if you think about the mAbs that are coming out, those are considered more biotech, but like pharmaceutical would be more of like taking a medicine like amantadine and repurposing it to like GoCovery or something. So more inert types of medications that either get repurposed or they're new. They're smaller molecules, but they're sort of inert. And under pharma, you can have big pharma, what they call big pharma, and then also smaller companies. And big pharma tends to be things like Roche, Genentech, Novartis, Eli Lilly. These are companies that have been around for, many, many years, like 50 to 100 years. And then under small pharma are those sort of smaller companies that, like a Neurocrine or Acadia, that are like just maybe that are starting out and they don't have sort of a big engine behind them, but they're still developing medications. Mm-hmm. And then under biotech, you can have pharma that's doing biotech, or you can have other smaller companies that are just starting out and they're developing. Like right now, people are looking at mAbs or ASOs, antisense oligonucleotides, or other types of drugs that are considered within the biotech realm. Big pharma, I don't know if this is helpful, but big pharma, they tend to have, they consider it much more stable.
So industry is a bit of an umbrella term, and just because it's a drug doesn't mean it's necessarily pharma. It could fall, it can be in the biotech world as well. And then within those, there's more nuance to the different types of companies as well, it seems like.
Yeah.
I guess going further in that vein, what is the role a practicing neurologist would transition to in this sector?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think when I think about pharma or biotech, there is definitely a real push to find neurologists because, the emerging field within pharma is within neurology, because this is kind of one area where for a long time there were no therapies and now they're, it's exploding. So if you think about MS, right? When I went to residency, it was ABCR. So it was the Avonex, Betaseron, Copaxone, and Rebif. And now it's totally different. The milieu is like, I think there are maybe 30 or so drugs that are all mAbs. And if you even look within Alzheimer's now, right, there's this real push to like go in, there are a lot of failures, but then there are also some things that are working. If you look at Eisai and Biogen and lecanemab, so there is a real push towards like neuro-rare disease and also movement disorders, with it Parkinson's disease or Alzheimer's disease. Or Huntington's disease, and then neurodegenerative, which is Alzheimer's as well. And for that reason, I think there is sort of a desire to find more neurologists. And within pharma, how I got in was through safety. So within pharma, it's completely different than anything you do in clinical. It's like a whole different field, and each company sort of is organized in different ways, but there are different types of work that the pharmaceutical companies do, and those are things that specialties are needed in. So when I started out in an area called safety, and so it was basically looking at compounds, and as you develop clinical trials, understanding what that safety profile looks like and helping to develop that, or understand, well, what kind of things do we need to be looking for? So for instance, let's just say for Alzheimer's disease, a lot of the drugs that are coming out have ARIA. And so it's, as a safety person, I would be trying to understand what those emerging signals look like. So what is ARIA? How do we look for ARIA? What are some tests we might do for ARIA? What's the incidence of it? And then during the course of the study, looking for things that may be a concern within ARIA or within the drug itself. And then, but then after safety, I moved into medical affairs and did a lot of work in Huntington's disease there. And that's just understanding sort of the landscape. So like, kind of, well, what is Huntington's disease? What is its incidence, prevalence? What do we know about it? What are the drugs that are in this field or not? And then trying to be able to, how do we create data that could help support potential drugs that come out? So, is there an unmet need? What kind of studies would we need to say to like payers or other physicians that, that this drug that we're doing is important and it's needed in this avenue. That's kind of what medical affairs does, but they do a bunch of other things too. And then since medical affairs, now I've moved into clinical development, which is now developing the molecule, right? So now you have a molecule and now you're creating studies. Maybe it's gone through phase 1, but now it's going to phase 2 or phase 3. So it's writing the protocol, handling the study dynamics, the study conduct, talking to investigators, trying to help them understand eligibility of the study, and then trying to move the study along and being a medical monitor within that study.
So you kind of answered, I think, a little bit my next question, which was, what does professional growth look like? And so would you say each of those moves from safety to medical affairs to drug development, are those parallel moves into different types of jobs, or are those sort of up the ladder, if you will?
No, that's a great question. I think when people go into any kind of professional job, you kind of have to ask yourself, like, what is my goal, right? There's some people who want to just move up the ladder, and that's totally fine, right? So they'll go into medical affairs or they'll go into safety, and they'll say, okay, I'm starting as an associate medical director, and now I'm a medical director, and now I'm a senior medical director, and then I want to be whatever the next step is, vice president, or, like you sort of move up the chain within that realm, right? And then there are other people who say, well, I want to learn as much as I can about maybe clinical development. So I'll do safety, but then I want to learn about medical affairs, but now I want to kind of go into a different realm and try clinical development. And so there are many ways that you can do that. And for me, that was more of a lateral move. I think I was less interested to move up the chain as I was to just understand what clinical development was. And I felt like, okay, sort of I got a taste of safety. That's interesting. But what do these guys do over here? Let me try that out. Oh, that's very interesting. But now I want to understand studies. So for me, it was more of like I was doing one thing and I thought this is interesting, but I don't understand how this other place fits into what I'm doing. So I moved over to that field. And then when I was in medical affairs, there was always this push towards making and designing studies. And I was like, well, I really need to understand what that means. So now I'll go into clinical development. So my trajectory was much more lateral because I wanted to learn different aspects within clinical development. But there are other people who are just, they're really satisfied in that one area and they just want to be like the king of their domain, and they just want to move up the ladder, and that's fine too.
Yeah. Now, it sounds like you're doing a lot of either understanding drugs or developing trials or designing trials and research. So do most people have to have a strong research background? Do you have to have a PhD to be able to work or transition into industry?
No, it's a great question. There are a lot of people, I would say quite a few. So if I had to look across the board, probably 50% or more do have MD PhDs, just because I think when you have a PhD, you're just really interested in data and understanding data. So it's like a very fluid or common thing for them. It's sort of a fluid thing. But there are quite a few people who don't have PhDs. I don't. I have a MPH, a Master's in Public Health, and I have an MD. And so it's not necessarily needed or a necessary component. And I think it's just because as physicians, medical school is so rigorous and we're taking large amounts of material, right, and learning them and trying to assimilate them in what we're doing. And so, just by nature, we have a lot of those qualities, and we're curious. We tend to be curious anyway. So it's really not needed. It's always a plus if you have research background, just because then you sort of you have kind of a leg up. Like if you've done research trials, then a lot of the vocabulary, vernacular, and some of the process to you is not as foreign. But you don't necessarily have to, because I think at the end of the day, like most physicians are very quick learners, and you just have to kind of open your mindset to say, okay, this is totally different, but I'm going to just open my mind up and just kind of understand and see how this fits. And I do think, I think there is a period of time where there are a number of physicians who ask themselves, have I made the right decision? Because this is just so different. But I think it's just a question of, I think it's that question of just having some grace and knowing that, yes, I was the master of my domain in this clinical realm, but I'm not right now in this realm, and I'm just going to learn and see how things go.
There's going to be a learning curve, and we've all learned to be learners. So
correct.
That actually transitions well into my next question, which was who's best suited for these kinds of jobs, and who might not be a good fit?
Yeah, I think
it's a pretty broad question.
No, it is a broad question, but it is very interesting, and it's also very astute to ask, because I think people assume, at least I did, how different could this be from clinical medicine? Like, oh, I have all this knowledge under my belt. Of course, I will just, I will transition very easily. And it was a very clunky transition for me for many reasons. One was you're no longer the master of your domain. So it's very humbling. You're in a venue with people who are very, very bright. And when you walk into the room, you aren't the person people will turn to for all the knowledge anymore, right? It is very, very dispersed, and there are people who know way more than you do. And so it's a very sort of humbling experience. But it also, I think, if you can check your ego at the door, I think you have the capacity to really kind of grow and learn from it. So I think, in my mind, people who are really very clinically minded, like they maybe aren't as excited about data or savvy about understanding data, may have a little bit of a disconnect. It might be much harder. People who maybe get their identity in being a physician and having that title, and like sort of live or feed off the fact that they walk into a room and people are like, hey, Dr. So-and-so, and giving grand rounds and feeling that sense of accomplishment, may not fit into this. And they may have some difficulties trying to find it.
Yeah, it sounds a bit different. I think we don't realize how much of our jobs place us in this position of being the expert when we walk into a room. With every patient encounter, we are the expert. And so
that's right.
We may not even recognize how much that is a part of our day-to-day clinical lives.
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, I think when I was transitioning, there was a person that I had trained with. I did my neurology training at UCSD in San Diego, and he had been my attending, looking at a job, and so he saw my name. He reached out to me. He's like, "Oh, Rita, yeah." He's like, I have to warn you that this is just completely different than anything you'll do clinically. And he said those exact words to me, that you are not going to be the smartest person when you walk into the room. Nobody is going to defer to you because you're a physician. You have to accept the fact that there are people who are way smarter, right? And it's a very humbling experience. And I had never really thought about that, so I think when I did enter, to me, it wasn't as much of a shock. Like I was able to assimilate quite easily, because I already had come in with that knowledge of like, well, I'm not going to be the smartest person in the room. That's okay.
You came in a bit prepared.
I came in prepared. That's right. I came in a bit prepared. Yeah.
So most people that I know who've gone, or we often hear about people transitioning to industry from after being in practice for a certain amount of time, whether it is serendipitous life circumstances, or whether there's something about clinical medicine that they're burnt out from, or whether there's something about industry that they're drawn to. But what about trainees who may have decided that clinical medicine or academic research is not for them, and they don't yet enter practice? Can they find jobs in industry without having practiced first?
Yes, definitely. And in fact, I remember there was when I was in medical affairs, one such individual straight out of residency, I think. Yeah, he did. I don't think he did fellowship. And so he transitioned into medical affairs, and I remember having conversations with him, because we had these talks of like, well, did I make the right choice? I'm not really sure, but I think no matter what, right, no matter even if you've practiced for 10 years or not, it's just so different that there's this like period of trying to wade the waters to figure out if this is right for me. But he's doing great, so he did medical affairs for a period of time, and now he's in clinical development. So the point is, it's a long-winded answer, but the point is that yes, that there are definitely avenues to enter without having any clinical experience, because the thought process is, that you have clinical experience as a resident,
Mhm.
right? So all the stuff that you've done, it's not without any merit. You bring all of that with you, and it's also the other skills that you bring as a physician in terms of your critical thinking and just understanding the dynamics of medicine that are very important.
Yeah.
So
That
absolutely.
makes sense. So we touched on this very briefly earlier when you were chatting, but salaries can vary widely depending on subspecialty, practice setting, particularly in the private practice, and I'm sure it's the same in industry. But generally speaking, should one expect to earn a comparable salary as they did in, say, let's say, academic medicine?
Absolutely. I think there are a couple things about about pharma or industry that are different. One is that you not only have a base salary, but you also can have a sign-on bonus, and then you also have bonuses that occur yearly that that are on top of what your salary is. And then in addition, companies will give you what they call stock options. So they're usually like they have different terms for them, but they're called SSARs or RSUs, but they're basically like stock options and actual stock, which actually, have a monetary value. So even if you feel like, well, my base salary isn't as high as like say something I might get in private practice, it is still pretty comparable because when you put your benefits and everything together, it is quite a bit of money. So which is different than what we do in practice because, I mean, I think I'm not sure how it is anymore, but even in academic medicine, when I first started, obviously it was my first salary, so I was like wowed by it. But over a 5-year period, right, it never changed.
Mm-hmm.
It really never went up. It stayed exactly the same.
Yeah.
And you don't get that in industry. Industry, your salary will go up every year. They call it an inflationary increase.
Oh, that's nice.
So
and
yes,
reasonable.
that's right. You do get increase. It's automatic. You get an increase in your salary, and then they look at your productivity and what you bring to the table, and based on that, they come up with a number for your bonus. And so you get a yearly bonus, and then it also in addition, you get the stock benefit as well.
So let's say someone has decided that they would like to transition into industry. How do they go about doing this? How do they find jobs? Where do they look? Is LinkedIn important? I've heard the term.
Yeah, no, it's such a great question. It's interesting, Sana, because I get emails through LinkedIn quite often with people saying, "Hey, can you help me? I'm interested. What kind of information can you give me?" I'm always really I'm just struck because I think for me, I sort of fell into it. It wasn't even something that I was looking for, but I think it's different now. So I think there are different things you can do. One, I think that's really important is networking. I think networking nobody ever puts the importance of that, but the more people you meet and the more you learn about industry, the better it is, because so much of what happens is behind closed doors. People will say, "Hey, I've got this position. Oh, I know the right person for that," right? "Oh, I'm thinking about this person," right? I think if someone refers you, that's always really important. So, like, for instance, I have a friend right now who's applying for a position, and she said, "Hey, can you refer me to this job?" And I said, "Sure." And so the difference between somebody who's already there at a company who says, "Hey, I know this person and I want to refer you," versus them sort of like just applying on their own made such a huge difference. And I was pretty astonished by that. And then the other thing too, I think, is to engage in activities that would make you poised for industry. So for instance, if you are really interested in clinical development or safety, learning more about clinical trials, maybe getting more involved. And I think they're also what they called CROs, which are, I forgot what it stands
Clinical
for.
research organization? No, contract research organization.
Yeah, contract research organizations. That's right. Thank you. I was like, clinical contract research organizations. And these are companies that aren't necessarily affiliated with certain pharma companies, but it's just a way for you to get the experience of helping with clinical trials or being in clinical trials that can get your foot in the door. So there are a lot of people who will work for a CRO, maybe as a 1099 employee, or they'll work for the CRO company, and then it's just an easy transition into pharma.
So one of I think the big things or the big differences, I'm sure, is also just the patient interaction. And, to get away from that might be some reason or one of the reasons that people leave clinical medicine, but I imagine you don't get much of that in industry. Do you find a way to still do a little bit of clinical medicine, or not really? Do most people just kind of transition completely?
So most people, they do some sort of hybrid. So most companies want, if you want to see patients, they're all for it, because it increases your experience and what you bring to the table.
Mm-hmm.
So I do have quite a few colleagues that actually see patients twice a month or once a week. And they may go into like academic centers and just volunteer their time. They can't get paid for that work because it's considered double dipping,
Okay.
but you can volunteer and still see patients. That typically lasts for a few years, and then often physicians are just tired because it's work. It's a lot of work, right? So they tend to transition out of it. But I do know of a lot of people, and in fact, I miss clinical medicine, so I'm re-engaging now, and I'm going to be seeing patients as a volunteer at an academic center. Again, yeah, because I was like, I would really like to see some Huntington's and Parkinson's patients again. I do miss it a little bit. So you have that option.
Oh, that's great. Okay, so but you cannot be paid for it, and you can't officially be employed by two organizations necessarily.
No, because it's considered a conflict of interest.
That makes sense. So, in the same vein, then people who are in practice or perhaps working part-time, can they work part-time in industry, or is it the same idea?
I believe it's the same idea.
Yeah.
I haven't met anyone who does that. Now, there are physicians, obviously, who are, say, on ad boards or do consulting work with the pharmaceutical industry, which to me is very different because you're still sort of externally facing, right?
Yeah.
You're just giving information. So that's very common. But to be sort of on the inner workings side, I think I don't believe you can do both.
Yeah, that makes sense. That was a silly question. It should go both. It makes sense, but it would go both ways.
But I don't think but I don't think it's a silly question. I think it's an important question to ask because I think it's not as intuitive as you think.
Are most of these jobs in sort of hubs that are tech industry or like the Bay Area, or are these jobs remote or most hybrid?
So prior to COVID, a majority of these companies, I would say 95%, you had to be local. You had to be, you would have to move to that area. So like with Eli Lilly, they're in Indiana, you had to move to Indiana. However, because of COVID, it's really opened up the way companies are now thinking. So for instance, my brother, who is, he's also a neurologist, and he lives in Tampa. He's a MS physician, and was working with USF and at the VA. He has just moved into industry. And so it was in August. But he lives in Tampa. So they said, no problem. They said, you can still live in Tampa, and we request that you come to, our headquarters. I believe it's like once every 3 months.
Oh, that's not bad.
So and it's interesting because even though Eli Lilly's in Indiana, his hub is in San Diego. So he'll fly to San Diego just to meet the team. But most of what he does is virtual. Yeah. So he's completely remote. But my company, which is Genentech, we were completely virtual for 2 years. And now they're saying, hey, you got to come back. So now we are required to go in 3 days a week. So 2 days a week we can work from home, but 3 days a week we have to go in. Now, that being said, there are people who work for Genentech who are remote, and so they get special accommodation to do that. So it is possible, but I think it's just a discussion you have to have with whoever is, like your hiring manager or whatever, just to have that discussion.
Yeah, and I imagine the landscape has changed during COVID, and then it'll be interesting to see how companies either evolve or go back, or what the new landscape is going to be in a post-COVID era.
Yeah. But, I think the one thing companies understand is that if you want to have good talent, you have to be flexible. right? So, if you are in a high cost of living area like the Bay Area, but you want good talent, it's going to be hard because to have people move here,
Mm-hmm.
where the average house is millions of dollars, is very difficult,
Yeah.
right? So you have to be more flexible, and I think they're starting to understand. They get that.
Any last words of wisdom or anything that our listeners should think about or know that we haven't talked about already?
I think no matter what you do or whatever field you decide to go into, whether it's industry or not, you just have to keep an open mind and give yourself some time, some grace, no matter what you do, because I think when you change whatever you're doing, there's always this learning curve. And so I think in general, a lot of physicians, we tend to be perfectionists and we tend to want to learn something and do it well. And sometimes, you just have to say, well, okay, I'm going to try my best and learn this, but then know that there's going to be a learning curve. So I think that to me is probably the most important. But just to keep an open mind, because I think one of the things about being a physician is that there are so many possibilities. It's not just clinical medicine anymore, whether it's consulting for companies or going into industry or starting out your own business, whatever it is. I think that as physicians, we are smart, hardworking, and we have a skill set that can help us propel us forward. So just to keep an open mind about other opportunities.
I think it's so interesting that you say that, because I think often as physicians, especially when you're specialized or subspecialized, we tend to think that we have a very narrow skill set, a very refined one, but very narrow. So it's nice to hear that there are ways to transition that or to pivot.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. With the caveat that you can, I think the thing about clinical medicine is that, you can always try something and you can always go back,
Yeah.
right? You have this skill set that you have. So if you feel like it isn't a good fit for you, just to be, cognizant of that and ask yourself why. Because it may not be the work you're doing. Maybe it's the company or the culture, right? But you need to ask yourself, if you do feel uncomfortable, why? Is it because you're not mastering it right away like you want? Is it maybe this, maybe, you're in safety and you just don't like safety and you'd rather do something else like medical affairs? So you just have to kind of ask yourself those questions about what you want to do and what you like to do so that you can find a good fit.
Yeah, I imagine it's like feeling like an intern all over again for a little while.
Yes. Yes.
Rita, thank you so much for your time. It was a pleasure speaking with you.
You too. Absolutely. Yeah.
Neurology Nuts and Bolts podcast was created and produced by Sarah Schaefer. It is not recorded as an official podcast of any institution or organization. The podcast is unfunded. Opinions are those of individual participants. Music by Audrey Knapp. Artwork by Shivani Ghoshal. Want more content like this? Be sure to subscribe to the Neurology Nuts and Bolts podcast to hear more about constructing your career in neurology. Follow us on Twitter at NeuroBolts and on Facebook at Neurology Nuts and Bolts to stay up to date on new content and give us feedback on what you want to hear. And tell your friends. Thanks for joining us.